Welcome everyone to this discussion today on the topic of Ukraine's relationship with the West and the West relationship in Ukraine. It's a very important topic for us to address now, given all of the events underway in the region, and also I think a topic that intersects with a broad array of issues relating to European politics, transatlantic security, and related issues. We're delighted to bring together today a group of very distinguished experts on both sides of the Atlantic to address these themes. So I'll start with a very brief introduction, then turn it over to some of our colleagues in Kiev and invite comments from participants there, and then bring it back to our Fletcher colleagues for their comments. For those who are listening, we invite you to put any questions you have in the chat box, and where possible, I'll try to pick up questions or invite some of the speakers to try to pick up questions as to address any issues that you raised that haven't yet been addressed. So I'm looking forward to an interesting hour and a half of discussion. And before we dive into the discussion, let me turn it over to my colleague, Ambassador Korsunsky, for any opening thoughts that he has. Now, I think you may be muted right now. We can't hear you.
Sorry, thank you so much. It's an honor to open our today's evening event for us. It's a kind of very interesting experience since we are working online during the pandemic time, our academy. But this is a kind of unusual event when we have such a distinguished colleagues to talk about important issues facing Ukraine. I would like first to introduce what we have from Ukrainian side. Actually, we are not just only part of us from Kiev. We have a very strong representation from Odesa, Dr. Yevgeniya Gaber and Dr. Dubovik. Those two, at least those two persons who will speak, they're from Odesa. So Black Sea in security, and that's in Yevgeniya's hands, and Mr. Dubovik is very famous in Ukraine, professional on specifically on US policy, and he is very often comment on that. So as for the other part of our team, Tatiana, Alexander Khara, Nikolai Kapitonenko, we are from Kiev, from different agencies, not just from academy, but all of us in many ways are dealing with foreign policy issues, advising the government, the parliament, etc. So let me start from commenting on the list of questions which were put forward before our meeting. And if you allow me not to start from the first one, which is about revolution in Ukraine 2014 and events in Belarus, because it's a kind of a difficult one. Let me begin from saying something, a couple of words about how United States, the EU and NATO perceived in Ukraine today, because that's the easiest part. Yesterday, our president endorsed the national security strategy of Ukraine, a kind of document which had to be prepared and endorsed many months ago, but because of different reasons, it just appeared yesterday. And in this document, the message is extremely simple and clear that US is #1 partner for Ukraine. This is first issue. And the second, that's membership in the EU and NATO. It's a major goal of foreign policy of Ukraine. So this is pretty simple. And if you would see how, if you conduct polls in Ukraine about the attitude toward the US, toward the NATO and EU, you will always see good numbers, double digits, and they're growing. And that is from simple reason, we consider United States as a major guarantor of the Ukrainian sovereignty and security vis-a-vis Russia in our war, and the assistance US provides us It's enormous and very, very important. But I have to say something as well, a couple of words about the EU and Germany and France. And this is another question on our list. And I have to tell you that we do have some kind of, I would not say problems, but we do have some expectations which are not fulfilled yet. Specifically, for example, I'll give you one simple figure. When the free trade agreement with the EU entered into force, 1st January 2016, and the signature of this agreement, that was exactly the beginning of the 2014 revolution in Ukraine. So 2 years later, agreement entered into force. At that moment, if you look at our trade sheet with the European Union, you will see that we are in minus 400 million euros. So we are more buying than selling to the EU. It's okay. But 3 years later, we have minus 5 billion euros. And that means that in spite of the new and very important achievement that trade with the EU is growing very quickly, and specifically, I mean, it's nothing comparable to what happened before. So before, major trade partners were situated on the east from Ukraine, I mean Russia, CSIS, but now, of course, that's the European Union. But EU used this agreement to achieve much more advantage vis-a-vis Ukraine than it was expected at the moment then agreement was entering into force. And that's kind of disappointment that we are now trying to initiate negotiations with you to reconsider this agreement. And then we come to Germany and France, again, being part of the Minsk group and discussions about the resolution in Donbass. We would expect much more stronger message, much more stronger policy. But when you listen to President Macron, and specifically it was very visible message in his speech in front of the meeting of French ambassadors in the end of last year. And it was very strange message because he was talking about, again, Russia is a great European state, Russia and common future and common partnership. Then he signed a lot of agreements with Russian Federation. In similar way, Germany acts. And we see a lot of economic projects in between, investment in between Russia and Germany, specifically Nord Stream 2. If not the Congress of the United States, and we very sincere saying Ukraine, God bless the Congress, because that's because of legislation of the Congress, sanctions were applied to this project, that it was stopped at the last moment. If they were very close to finalization of the construction of extremely dangerous pipeline, which will deprive Ukraine from billions of revenues and from the huge part of our cooperation with the European Union. So I'm not saying that everyone is doing wrong and we are just perfect. I would love to see much more stronger policy from Ukraine, our own plans, our own vision, how to resolve issues in Donbass, what to do with Crimea, how we see future of relations with the European Union and Russia, because Russia will not disappear tomorrow. So we have to see a clear understanding what to do. We're still in the process of defining of this kind of prospect. And again and again, we are now in Ukraine, this is kind of hot discussion that we must be proactive. We must not rely and we must not always ask Western partners to help and for intervening into our affairs with Russia. We have to be much more sober in our own opportunities. So that's my brief introduction, my brief remarks, and I am absolutely sure we do have many other and alternative views from my colleagues. So please feel free. That's why we are doing this, to have a discussion, to exchange the views. So thank you so much.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for kicking off our discussion with those comments. Perhaps we can turn to Dr. Dubovik next to see if he has any thoughts on the current state of the relationship.
Sure, can you hear me? Yeah, good. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Ambassador Korsunsky. Thank you, everyone who invited me to take part. I think it's really telling how diverse is Ukraine these days, that people sitting at the very top, the Diplomatic Academy of Ukraine, are still not forgetting about people in province, you know, in the periphery and the coast of the Black Sea. So thank you very much. Actually, there's no sarcasm here whatsoever, because our colleagues from GAU, they often invite us for various events, and we're happy to contribute. It's really good to be here today. It seems like that's live today. And just today I was informed that classes were interrupted, offline classes for me, and most probably perhaps for the rest of this semester. Unfortunately, there are some COVID cases in a group of students that I'm working with. So for now, at least to the end of the week, I'll be doing online work. And of course, we've been doing this since March, all sorts of events like this one. Good to see the colleagues, some of them I know. Oxana Shevel, whom I know really well. Haven't seen you this year because there was no honors this year, obviously. And Elizabeth Prodromou, actually we met in Austin, you might not remember, at the conference on religion in politics and security. So, and I'm looking forward to find out more about other colleagues on the Fletcher side. So very briefly, first, I would like to mention a few things about the first several questions there, and then focus on Ukraine-US relations. On the lessons for Belarus of events in Ukraine, I think it's very important for the West to be on the right side of the issue, and I think it's very there's no ambiguity here in terms of who's right, who's wrong there. So I mean, Lukashenko is wrong, obviously, and the people who don't want to help him anymore, they're right. So values matter. Standing with right people, standing with the people, standing with civil society, especially when this is such an overwhelming response as it is in Belarus. It's very important. I mean, some people might argue you don't want to upset this fragile security arrangement here and there in the region, the geopolitics as well. What if Russia takes up Belarus? And they are relevant concerns, but at the same time, Russia might still take up Belarus, whatever the West does or doesn't do, because the leverage is limited. The instrumentarium is very limited there for the West. But I think the values still matter, and things like human rights matter and free elections matter. So if anything, the West shouldn't give up on Belarus and Belarusians and Belarusian civil society. So stand firm with your message. Sanctions, maybe how active, how efficient or effective they will be. That's a different matter entirely for our conversation. I mean, but at least continue to hammer that message of Lukashenko being in the wrong, and that he has to go, and that is not fine what he's doing to his own country, his own people. In terms of US, EU, and NATO, and how they're received in Ukraine, they are, as Professor Korsunsky and Ambassador Sergiy already said, they are perceived mostly positively. However, there are some fluctuations. Early on when the conflict with Russia started, the Russian aggression in 2014, so that would be 14, 15, 16, there were highest marks there for the support in Ukrainian public for US, EU, NATO. It's going down somewhat, because sometimes there's not enough of interaction, sometimes there are confusing messages, like on the part of the US, I'll go through this, but one day you hear something from President Trump about how he loves President Putin, and one day, another day you have something which was coming from the rest of the administration, so that's confusing to a lot of people. On EU, the new windows of cooperation, the new avenues of cooperation, they should be open all the time. Like right now, we're talking about a renewed association agreement with the EU, which is very important because the current format is underused, I've been told, by people who focus on monitor developments in that respect. With NATO, there's a lot of interaction, specifically with this new enhanced opportunities format. So NATO can do a lot to Ukraine, but still Ukraine is not part of NATO. So here in Ukraine, you're having people who are often disillusioned with how not enough in their mind, to their estimate, we have received assistance from US or EU or NATO. They would like to get more, but at the same time, if you look at this properly, you understand that all those three players, they've done something, and it's not just symbolic, but very meaningful to help Ukraine through in this last 6 years. Getting to US, I mean, I don't think there should be a new agenda for Ukraine-US relations because the current agenda is working. I'm fine with it, and most people who I'm following and who's doing some analysis on US-Ukraine relations, they think the agenda is established there. We know our priorities, we know our common interests, we know what we're trying to do. You know, US is the friend of Ukraine and vice versa, more or less on the political level and also in terms of public perception, as I said. So the discussion is about like details, minor technical things as we go forward, like how those priorities should be better implemented. And quite frankly, I would prefer for a new administration to come into place in the US, but that's for you guys to decide who you want to have after November 3rd. But that being said, even under this administration, there were no sizable, you know, strategic radical changes in American approach to Ukraine, apart from certain messages and statements and misstatements coming specifically from the White House, specifically from some people in the president's office and around him. Other than that, if you see what the DoD is doing, what the state is doing, what others are doing, they're helping Ukraine the same way they were helping Ukraine under Obama. So that's very good that actually you have some consensus. It's pretty much anchored, entrenched in American policy towards Ukraine. So that's the way we want to see it going forward. If Trump is re-elected, I think there will be extra pressure on that consensus, and there might be some changes eventually, because we all know the second term is not first term, and the president can do more if he follows his impulses that he apparently still has in terms of reaching out for this grand bargain with Russia or something, perhaps at the expense of Ukraine. That could be detrimental to US-Ukraine relations to some extent, but we'll see. But if it's Biden, you know, it's more or less a status quo. It's more or less to what we had prior to 2017, and that's good. Several risks, finally, that I see is there are several. Some are more on the Ukrainian side, some on the American side. First, of course, is that America can be tired of helping Ukraine. The public attitudes and appetite for helping Ukraine might decrease because we are in the 7th year of conflict with Russia. The longer it's running, you know, the bigger is the risk that we become Transnistria or Abkhazia. And do we hear much about American diplomacy on those fronts? Not really. So Ukraine is different, but at the same time, people are getting tired, you know, used to the conflict. It's ongoing. It's low activity. It's not, you know, it's a proxy conflict. So people might be tired in terms of should we still continue support Ukraine, to what extent, what amount of money should we send their way. Second thing is, of course, there's the realpolitik school of thought, which is very active and alive and kicking. And actually, I think it's very much attacking on offensive right now, saying that whatever we do, you know, there are red lines. Ukraine is next to Russia. There's very little we can do. So let's live with this, and let's assume that how we phrase, how we articulate our policy towards Ukraine should be guided by this assumption that there is much more Russia can do, and there's much more stronger Russian vested interest in Ukraine compared to what the US have in Ukraine. And most finally, there is a lot that Ukraine can do. I mean, if you fail with reforms, if it's another, you know, window opportunity closed, if it's another round of new people in power now and yet not succeeding with reforming the country and fighting corruption and so on, that's another risk, obviously, and a huge risk, not only for US-Ukraine relations in terms of just bilateral top-to-top, government-to-government relations, but also in terms of you know, assistance coming through the Senate, for instance, and House, where the people might be soon, you know, talking aloud about like how are we helping Ukraine or trying to help Ukraine when there is not enough sign of Ukraine trying to help itself. You know, when a lot of things are stalled, when the reforms are stalled, and the progress is not obvious. And I think that that should also be seen as a risk if Ukraine stagnates the way it did in terms of reforms in the last several years, or actually for 3 decades almost now. You know, then there's also a risk of a certain degradation or deterioration of US-Ukraine relations. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Dubovik. Perhaps we could turn now to Dr. Yevgeniya Gaber, if she has any comments she'd like to add.
Thank you, Chris. Can you hear me? So thank you once again. I'd like to start, as well as my colleagues, from extending gratitude to the Fletcher School for organizing the event. It's really a great opportunity not only to share our ideas, but also to hear yours on Ukraine and on the regional developments. And I'd like to make several general comments, not going into details on a specific particular issue, maybe a little bit with the focus on NATO. Well, what we are witnessing now and what we've been witnessing for the recent years, I would call it kind of a transition and transformation processes. And those transformation processes are happening at the same time on the global level, like a transition from the so-called liberal post-Cold War world to the post-liberal world, with the realpolitik very often being at the core of it. And this is something that I think Ambassador Korsunsky mentioned a little bit, of national interest being the top priority and actually affecting all other relationships between countries and between both sides of Atlantic. We are witnessing a transformation within European Union and within NATO. And now when you ask a question whether Ukraine wants to not join the EU and NATO, the answer is yes, but in Odesa, we generally answer to a question with another question. And that second question, follow-up question would be, what kind of the EU are we talking about? Post-Brexit EU, current EU with the problems after COVID, after economic decline in some spheres and so on, and what kind of NATO are we talking about? Because NATO itself is in a state of transformation, of reconsidering its role in the neighborhood and in the Black Sea in particular. And what we're seeing as well is transformation, so-called post-communist transformations. We used to have all these courses in the university back in 1990s and in the early 2000s, but I think that the basically real post-communist transformations have started since 2014, probably, with the so-called revolutions, Orange Revolution in 2004, and then Euromaidan in 2014, in Georgia as well. In Belarus, what we're witnessing now is also kind of a shift from the previous, still mostly communist post-Soviet state to a modern state in the heart of Europe. So this creates a general framework which offers a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of challenges, both to NATO, to EU, to the US, and to Ukraine. What can be done about this and what opportunities might be found here for Ukraine, for example, in Ukrainian NATO relations, in Ukrainian Western relations? I would say that would be a shift on several levels. One is a shift from political support to practical measures and to practical steps. What I mean here is not making a step back on the high political level, but also together with the political slogans, together with all these values, talks, concerns, and so on, moving on a practical stage of implementing very specific measures. So now we have NATO and EU membership in the constitution. Now we have NATO not only as part of a foreign policy, but also as part of national security policy, since it was also included in the new edition of the national security strategy. But what is important here is also not to forget about low profile, very sustainable efforts at different levels. Interoperability in the armed forces, adopting legislation in the parliament, whatever is needed, expert meetings in very specific areas, starting from cyber attacks up to cooperating on different issues of bilateral dialogue. So these practical measures dimension would be very important. That would help bring our partnership forward. And I believe that would also help us to prevent some unfair favorable developments in case of change of political leadership or using NATO membership or EU membership, just as, for a heated political debate in Ukraine and in the United States, for example, before some kind of elections. So second one would be a shift from one-way cooperation, like Ukraine accepting some kind of assistance or help from the United States, from the West, from EU and NATO, to a mutually beneficial partnership, because Ukraine has also a lot to offer, especially vis-a-vis Russia, especially vis-a-vis neighborhood, vis-a-vis Black Sea region, starting from knowledge of Russian political culture, political profile of President Putin, up to real combat experience. Because I used to work in Turkey, and I remember NATO generals coming to Turkey and asking our Ukrainian generals and officers what they think about some kind of radar systems, what they think about the UAVs, for example. Are they efficient or not? Because it's in Ukraine that we have this real experience of combat operations with Russia. So here in this respect, Ukraine could also contribute a lot and change its image for European partners and for NATO as well. And last point I'd like to make, and try to keep it short, is also a shift of NATO policy and Western in general, EU and NATO visions regarding the Black Sea region and regarding this part of the world. So that would be probably a shift in terms of strategic vision from some kind of distant outskirts. So yes, it's important for us, but it's still somewhere there on the eastern flank, up to understanding that this is basically a very important and crucial part for the European and Euro-Atlantic security. And now it's in Poland, it's in the Baltic states, it's in the Black Sea and Sea of Azov that a lot of developments happen in Belarus, by the way, which will affect NATO members and the EU members themselves. So it's not only a threat like Russian aggression, for example, it's not only a threat for Ukraine itself, but what happens in Crimea now, what happens in Donetsk and the Lugansk regions, what happened in Ukraine and Belarus is something that NATO itself and EU itself should probably see as a threat or a risk for itself. There have been some changes after the Warsaw Summit and especially after Brussels Summit in 2018 with the tailored forward presence in the Black Sea and the region. But I think this is something we could build upon and elaborate with all kinds of increasing physical presence of NATO in the Black Sea basin where it is possible regarding Turkey's position on the Montreux Convention, of course, but still that might be on rotational basis, that might be something with the visits of solidarity to ports, that might be something as the developments which are happening now, like the flights of American and NATO strategic bombers with the Ukrainian strategic jets over the territory of Ukraine, just to show that Ukraine is also a part of this transatlantic security area and not somewhere there left one by one with Russia. So I think I'll stop here, but I'll be glad to comment and to answer the questions.
Great, thank you very much for those thoughts. Perhaps we can turn now to Professor Oxana Shevel. Oxana, if that works for you.
Yes, sure. Thank you again, Chris, for inviting me, and great ideas there. Since we only have 5 minutes, like as we were instructed originally, I'm going to keep my comments brief, and for that reason, I think I'll just comment on the issues. One of the questions on the list that we had that specifically dealt with Crimea and Donbass, because I feel like I have potentially maybe more things to say on that than on trade and things like that. So the question was how Germany, France, US can assist Ukraine in negotiating with Russia over Donbass and Crimea. And I think I'll begin by saying that even the framing of the question is already good, because we're actually including Crimea in there, which is often just kind of forgotten, right? Like it's in a way, and that's kind of would be my first maybe set of comments. I don't really obviously have any solutions, but I wonder if and whether US and Western partners more generally could do more, if there is anything that could be done more to kind of keep Crimea on the agenda, or is this sort of everybody agreed in a way kind of, lost cause, right? And obviously, we are not going to be able, nobody's going to be able or willing to kind of go to war with Russia to retake Crimea, right? I think at the same time, keeping it on the agenda and sort of putting pressure on Russia and reminding it that it's actually did steal a bit of Ukraine's territory and violated all sorts of laws and its own commitments, might offer some sort of like negotiating advantage, perhaps, right? Like I know Russians, I've been in some audiences with Russian diplomats, and they just don't want to hear about it. Like as soon as like the word Crimea is mentioned, they sort of like get all upset, right? But at the same time, I wonder, right, if actually keeping the issue on the agenda might be helpful. Now, kind of related to this, I also wonder if either in Ukraine, and this maybe would be the question to Ukraine's colleagues like Ambassador Korsunsky and others, are Ukrainians even concerned that Russians might just go in to try to get water to Crimea? Because there is now this severe water crisis, right? The canal that supplies water, kind of, as I understand it, sort of the technical part of it is in Ukraine's territory proper, like mainland Ukraine, right? If they run out of water there and they went in and said this is for humanitarian reasons, right? Like, who is going to do anything about it? Like, is this something, I think that's something that we're thinking about. And like last thing I want to mention about Crimea, again, my understanding is that Western approach has been kind of similar to what it has been to the Baltic countries during the Cold War, right? In other words, the annexation is not recognized, but that's kind of like the new normal, sort of, right? And I wonder if this is really a good parallel, right? Because first of all, the situation in the Baltics only changed due to this major geopolitical calamity, like fall of the Soviet Union, right? Like, are we really expecting, right? Like, and say had that not happened, had Gorbachev started reforms, had Soviet Union still patted along, right? Probably the Baltic countries would still be part of, you know, that geopolitical space. And secondly, I also think it's a little bit maybe misleading analogy, because I think as far as attitudes in the Baltic countries in the communist period and attitudes in Crimea towards the annexing quote unquote state are quite different, right? I'm not going to say, because, you know, it's obviously much more complicated. I mean, the referendum was a sham, and it's not the case. Like the polls that we did have from Crimea before the annexation showed only about 30% of the population in favor of joining Russia. But we also know that attitudes do change, right? So I think this kind of like anti-Soviet sentiment that existed in the Baltics through the annexation period, I don't really think it's as comparable to the anti-Russian sentiment that's in Crimea. So I wonder again if this is really kind of the best analogy and the best way to think about it. So that's, I'll sort of leave it at that. And then I'll just say a couple of things about Donbass. And again, I'm not going to be very diplomatic because I'm not a diplomat and I don't have to be. But it does seem to me, and there are some voices in Ukraine that admit this, actually most recently Kravchuk, former president himself, that that agreement is ultimately not possible to implement. Because the terms of it are such that, you know, if you kind of follow the letter of the law, right, where the control of the border essentially follows, right, some sort of special status and elections, like that is like a Trojan horse that would be put into Ukraine, right? Like that's essentially what Russia wants, right? To have this region have a special status that would be able to veto decisions of the central government, including on Euro-Atlantic integration and all of these things, right? Like, I don't think anything other than perhaps the most pro-Russian Ukrainian government, like the opposition bloc, would agree to this, right? But on the other hand, the terms of the agreement are such that I think Ukraine's hands are really tied. The only thing that they have been pushing for, and I wonder again to hear from colleagues if you know everybody thinks that's really the best approach, is to kind of latch on to this clause that elections have to be held under the international standards and the OSCE terms, right? So basically, you know, if you have to have elections, such as opposition parties can campaign, right? Like some sort of election commission of Ukraine would count the votes, right? There has to be media presence. Like the separatists are not agreeing to any of these things. And that really seems to be the only leverage that Ukraine has, right? And otherwise the agreement is really not beneficial to Ukraine, right? So I wonder, again, like talking about what US could do, what Western partners could do, what, you know, again, going back to a point was made earlier about kind of more activist position in Ukraine, more maybe creative ideas. Is there plan B? Right? Like, is there like, are Ukrainian policymakers that are doing these policies now? Do they have some thoughts on this right now that we have Kravchuk on record saying like, we can't implement this agreement, like what's next? So I'll stop here because as I said, like I don't really have any solutions. I just wanted to put these questions on the agenda. And since so many knowledgeable people here, maybe we can have some interesting brainstorming. And I'll just mention one last thing. I actually do in my class, I teach post-communist politics class. And we end for the last actually 5 years, the last week of class, we do a simulation of how to solve conflict in Donbass. So students divide in these 4 groups, actually how to implement Minsk. The Russians, the Ukrainian government, the separatists, and the Western powers, and they go at it. They study all the documents. They really try. Sort of their prompt is like, on the one hand, to try to reach a solution, but also to stay within the parameters of what their side would credibly agree on. And invariably, they cannot find a solution. For like 5 years in a row, I'm not saying my students are geniuses, although they're good, smart, tough students. But like that sort of goes to show that this agreement is really, really, really difficult. I mean, and arguably impossible to implement. So that's something to think about. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Oksana. A lot of big questions to put on the table. Let's turn now to Professor Elizabeth Prodromou. Elizabeth?
Thank you, and thank you for organizing this, and it's a pleasure to be part of such a distinguished panel. I'm not a Ukraine expert, so in thinking about the Ukraine-West relationship, I'm going to introduce a couple of things that fall within the confines of the questions you pose to us, but that are, come from a slightly different vantage point. And the first point that I wanted to introduce was the importance of cultural diplomacy, and more specifically religious diplomacy, and the way that has affected Ukraine-US relations and also Ukraine-Russia relations. And I wanted to turn back to an event that was much in the news for 2019, throughout 2019, but has kind of fallen to the wayside. But nonetheless, I think is very important in thinking about the overall Ukraine-West and Ukraine-East relationship, and that is the issue of the granting of the Tomos of Autocephaly to create by the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople to Kiev to revert back to the historic autocephalous church in Ukraine. And I wanted to frame that within the context of the way in which Russia has been using cultural diplomacy, but also more specifically religious diplomacy as part of Moscow's overall geopolitical strategy of preventing what it considers to be the dangers of NATO expansionism into Russia's traditional near abroad, what Russia calls its near abroad, under the rubric of Ruski Mir. And so the controversy in the soft power conflict over the establishment of the autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine, I think is paradigmatic because, as we know, Putin has been using soft power as the handmaiden to his hard power moves. And for example, he justified the annexation of Crimea and the truncation of Ukraine's sovereignty by deploying the concept of Ruski Mir. And he talked about Russians as living in a divided nation that could be only reunified under Russian power. So we see the annexation of Crimea as a hard power move, but one that has been supported by soft power discourse. And we see that same thing happening when it comes to the discussions about the Tomos of Autocephaly and the ongoing relationship between the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and other Orthodox majority countries, and the relationship with the United States and the way Russia has portrayed that. And I wanted to emphasize that the fallout from the decision to grant that Tomos of Autocephaly, which severed the Patriarchate of Moscow's control over all of the Orthodox churches in Ukraine, that the fallout of that decision, which has produced a lot of fragmentation amongst Orthodox majority countries in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, it continues to the present. And if we look at the recent elections, for example, in Montenegro, where the discussion about the establishment of an autocephalous church, Orthodox Church of Montenegro, was narrated in the Serbian press and back in the Russian press, is one more effort by the United States to use religious diplomacy to create fragmentation in Southeastern Europe and to promote the NATO agenda. That kind of narrative positions Ukraine as the bad apple in what would otherwise be a putatively united Orthodox world. And so in terms of the use of cultural diplomacy as a tool for Moscow's own ambitions and its competition with NATO and the West, Ukraine finds itself in this interesting but complex position where the narrative about Ukrainian cultural identity, national identity, and the way religion figures into that is in some ways is being written either in Moscow or arguably in the United States or Europe. At least that's the narrative. The second point that I wanted to make concerns Ukraine's southern flank, and Dr. Gaber touched on this, and more specifically here, the evolution of Ukraine-Turkey bilateral relations, which not incidentally is somewhat related to the previous point. The many high-level meetings between Ukrainian and Turkish political leadership, including meetings between President Erdogan and President Zelensky, have continued to the present. And under the umbrella of the Ukraine-Turkey High-Level Strategic Council, the two countries have really tried to move forward their partnership and cooperation in areas of defense, trade, and infrastructure. And that means trans-regional cooperation, which creates opportunities for Ukraine, linking Central Asia and the Caucasus, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe. So again, positions Ukraine as this crucial connector. But the fact of the matter is that the relationship between Turkey and Ukraine has been very rocky. The free trade negotiations have, come up against repeated impediments, and from Kyiv's perspective, those have been largely due to Turkey. And it's in this context that I think Ukraine has come to see its relationship with Turkey as one that, from Ankara's perspective, is based on realpolitik, a highly pragmatic approach that in many ways aims to allow Ankara to use Ukraine as a kind of pawn in its own relationship with NATO and the West and with Russia. Because after all, on the one hand, we have this, a whole high-level strategic council and, multi-level security dialogue underneath that. But at the same time, while Turkey condemned Russia's annexation of the Crimea, that hasn't stood in the way of Turkey buying S-400, the S-400 air defense missile system from Russia. Although Turkey did not stand in the way of the autocephaly agreement, even when Putin made a direct appeal to Erdogan. Turkey has contributed to this narrative as Ukraine being nothing more than a pawn of the United States, the Office of the Secretary of State, and the Office of International Religious Freedom when it comes to cultural diplomacy. So the Turkey-NATO relationship, the Turkey-Russia relationship, the Russia-NATO relationship creates a kind of triangle with Ukraine at the center. Making for this kind of complex intersection of hard power and soft power relationships with enormous potential, but also a lot of risk, because it requires a real ability to move from the 10,000-foot policy strategic level to the very granular level of bilateral relationships at the state-to-state level, but also at the religion-to-religion level. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. For our final set of comments, I'll turn it to Dr. Arvanitopoulos. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to make a brief comment regarding the relations between the European Union and Ukraine. In a sense, reacting to the comments that our colleague Ambassador Korsunsky made. And I think that there is no question that the signing of the association agreement and the Deep Comprehensive Trade Act was an act of strategic geopolitical significance for Ukraine. And as Ambassador said, that led to the revolution and the resistance against Russia and its attempt to deny Ukraine its European choice as a democratic and independent state. And there is no question that the cost of this struggle have been very high for Ukraine in terms of territory, in terms of economic cost, and above all, human life. And as a consequence of that, one can expect that it's only natural that the Ukrainian expectations from the West are running very high. But let me make a couple of comments with respect to the implementation of the free trade area that Ambassador Korsunsky mentioned. And my record here is a bit different than the one that the ambassador presented. And I have here the report of the Commission on the implementation of the free trade area. And if we take into consideration that the basic premise of the free trade area is the elimination of tariffs, we have a different picture than the one that it was presented. And by that, I mean that the European Union, after 2014, and especially after 2016, has liberalized its access to Ukrainian exports. It eliminated tariffs to the extent of 94.7%. Ukraine, on the other hand, has been given a period of 7 years to eliminate its tariffs. So we see a progressive period of elimination of tariffs on the part of Ukraine. And as a result, my record here shows that exports, Ukrainian exports to the European Union jumped by 30% in 2017. And at the same time, the European Union share of Ukrainian exports and imports increased dramatically, owing, of course, to the steep declines in trade with Russia. And also in 2019, if we look at the numbers, exports from Ukraine to the European Union have increased by 7.8%, almost 8%. While imports, on the other hand, from the European Union, as Ambassador said, have increased, but only by 9%. So, and if you look at the total trade record, trade balance sheet, and exports, Ukrainian exports to the European Union remains the primary export market for Ukraine by a number of 42.4%. And if you look at the trade agreements, and forgive me for being technical, but this is actually what we went through when Greece applied and eventually joined the European communities. And trade is a very technical issue. And the main goal is in the end of the line to have a win-win situation. And I do think, as I look at the numbers and I look at the relations between the European Union and Ukraine as they evolve in the trade area, that we have a fair game here. For example, the European Union has accepted a sectoral safeguard for Ukraine's car industry, accepting for the Ukraine car industry to be protected for a period of 15 years. And of course, there are many disputes regarding a number of products like unprocessed wood or soybeans, but these are technical issues. And for that reason, I think we have set up an arbitration panel to settle all these issues. So it seems to me that if we look at the total of trade and trade issues between Ukraine and the European Union, I would see the glass half full rather than half empty. And to end with one comment regarding European Union's commitment to not only to Ukraine but its Eastern neighborhood policy, I would add that since we live in the COVID era, that the European Union offered support to all the countries the 6 countries that belong to its European partnership, to Eastern Partnership. An aid package that includes about 80 million for immediate needs and about 850 million to help mitigate with the socioeconomic aspects of impact of the crisis. So I do think that there is a commitment on the part of the European Union, and I think that the process of the association and the trade integration is a gradual process. So I would tend to see the glass half full rather than half empty when it comes to European-Ukrainian trade agreements. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Constantine. I see that Alexander Khara has his hand raised, so perhaps we can turn to him next, and I'll encourage anyone else who would like to jump in with comments or questions to anyone who has spoken thus far. Please raise your hand in the Zoom feature, or put a question in the chat box, and I'll try to turn to you. But Alexander Khara.
Oh, thank you. First of all, it's a great pleasure to take part in such diverse and interesting panel. I would like to develop a couple of points on Black Sea security and on Ukrainian-American relations. And I would like to develop the ideas that my colleagues put forward in these dialogues. Certainly, the US-Ukraine relations are of the key importance for Ukraine. And certainly we are just in time of uncertainty, what's to expect from the American people in November, and then from the incoming or incumbent administration. But anyway, the key interest of Ukraine in the United States is bipartisan support. Fortunately for us, we stayed outside of the domestic quarrels in the Congress, in the administration. And fortunately, we have a mixed, let's say, a picture. From one hand, Trump was trying to make this big bargain with Mr. Putin, but at the same time, his administration, national security establishment, has done much more than the previous administration that masterfully created diplomatic, let's say, leverage over Russia. So we would like to see further support, first and foremost, in the defense and security reform and support of Ukrainian armed forces, military assistance, further weapons sales. I believe that it's time to talk about the major non-LA status. It's something that is a goal that is achievable for Ukraine, and it will serve the United States as well. For the simple reason, what's going on in Donbass, in Black Sea, it's not just about Russian aggression over Ukraine. It's the bigger picture is the Russian advance, encroachment into the western borders, and let's say, with the aim to shaken the transatlantic and whole European integrity. If we have a look at the map, and we will see the bubbles of insecurity, A2, AD, from Kaliningrad to Crimea, then to Syria, and now we have the new intel that Russians deployed their S-300 or S-400 in Libya. So it says that it's not about Ukraine. It says that what Russia is doing in Crimea, in the Black Sea, it enables it to project its power beyond the Black Sea, not just over these poor NATO countries. I mean, poor in terms of capabilities. I mean, Romania, Bulgaria, first and foremost. The other thing that is really important is the change in Russian nuclear posture. They degraded the level or the threshold they can use nuclear weapons against other states. Now it includes non-nuclear states, and certainly Ukraine falls into this category. And secondly, we know that Russians restored the nuclear storage facilities in Crimea to facilities that had been built during the Soviet time. And certainly they have fleet capable of carrying these nuclear weapons. So the problem with this that nobody is addressing this issue, unfortunately, first and foremost, my government. It's not just about the nuclear. The Russians modernized their fleet in Crimea. And in 2 or 3 years, they will double the firepower of caliber missiles. Capable of reaching as far as the British shore. So it's the issue of a real threat to the European partners, but they are not talking about it. What could be done? First and foremost, there should be sanctions in place imposed for Crimean annexation and then the war in Donbass. But I believe it's time to expand these sanctions over the Russian military industrial complex that is connected to the annexed, to the enterprises, Ukrainian enterprises in the next Crimea. It would undermine the Russian ability to modernize its fleet and certainly to pose a greater threat to the EU and the NATO, and certainly in some cases to the American interests. Certainly would like to see more non-Black Sea states, NATO states, patrolling high waters in Black Sea and the overflights over Ukrainian territory and Crimea as well. And certainly we welcome what the United States is doing for some time. I mean, the overflight of the strategic bombers over Crimean Peninsula. One more thing that we were talking about Crimea. We're talking Azov Sea de facto annexed by Russians because they impose their domestic regulations over the free trade and free flow of the commercial ships. But we should talk about Odesa, not the water crisis. Certainly it might be a trigger for the amphibious operation against Ukraine, but in much let's say, efficient way how to undermine Ukrainian security and economy is by imposing embargo on the free trade from Odessa and other ports of the Black Sea. So after Russians annexed Crimea and they seized a couple of towers in the near Odessa region, they are pumping out our gas, but they deployed the military units on these platforms. And there is a permanent duty of the Black Sea fleet's ships over there. So they can cut our let's say, lane of trade with the world, and it would undermine our security instantly. So what we need certainly is to boost our ability to protect ourselves with our interests onshore, offshore, and certainly to secure our lanes. And in time when we don't have such a capability, we would love to see more American and certainly Europeans patrolling sea routes and protecting free trade. With regard to the Ukrainian-American relations, finally, there are some risks with incoming democratic administration. I would like to mention. First and foremost, the Democrats are keen to have these multilateral agreements, and certainly they're keen to extend START agreement as well. And it's one of the things that Russians are using to have this big bargain and to over the Ukraine as well. We would like to see Ukraine invited in such talks because it's the issue of the threat from Russia towards its neighbors, I mean nuclear threat. And certainly we as the countries that gave up nuclear weapons some decades ago, we would love to see the price, we would like to see appreciation of such a move. And it's certainly our say should be there in such negotiations. So we'd like to see more, let's say, intense relations with the United States, more, how to say, more intense dialogue on the highest level, and particularly on the level of the Congress and Parliament and the military-to-military contacts. So we'd like to see more the United States in Ukraine in time when the Europeans are more keen to protect or pursue their own interests. And then we see this, particularly with Germany, that is trying to push forward in Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is not just undermine our economic benefits, but would create a possibility for Russian military advance, full-scale advance, if there is no threat to undermine supply of gas towards the European and first and foremost German customers. So it's not the issue of Ukrainian economy or Ukrainian-Russia relations. It's the issue of the European stability and security as a whole. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for those comments. I'll turn now to Alan Henrikson, a professor emeritus at Fletcher School, and then perhaps after that back to Ambassador Korsunsky for any thoughts he has on these comments thus far. But Alan, please. Alan, I think your computer is still muted.
There, am I okay now? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chris, and also thank you, Ambassador Korsunsky, for accepting the proposal that we join up within the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training. The Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy is part of a now global network of diplomatic academies and institutes of international relations. We've tended in the past to meet, to compare notes, but now we're actually engaging in exchanges and possibly even cooperation at some point when health conditions permit actually meeting at our respective institutions. I would like to pick up on something, Ambassador Korsunsky, that you said at the very beginning about the United States being, from Ukraine's perspective, the word you used was guarantor, that the United States is the guarantor of Ukraine's sovereignty and security. That's a very powerful statement. The United States does not have a treaty relationship, a security treaty relationship with Ukraine. Although that was proposed, particularly during the George W. Bush administration. when President Bush and Vice President Cheney, Secretary Rumsfeld were actively engaged in an effort to bring not only Ukraine but Georgia, into the NATO organizational framework. So there's no formal treaty relationship. There is, of course, the United Nations Charter, which people tend to overlook, where the integrity of all states, large and small, is protected. But of course, given the structure of the United Nations, with the permanent five and with the requirement of unanimity of the permanent five, that is the veto, Russia as well as China can block any kind of action. Now, one of the problems with regard to the US and other countries protecting, or in a sense, guaranteeing Ukrainian security vis-a-vis Russia, is that there's an ambiguous legal relationship between what Russia is doing and the West. In the case of Crimea, which has been discussed today, the little green men that came in were not identified, as such. So the Russian government has maintained an attitude of deniability, and almost has offered itself as a kind of honest broker in the situation. I mean, everybody knows the facts of the situation, but formally speaking, Russia is ostensibly at least a part of the solution, as in the Normandy format. Now, Ukraine, I know, has tried in various contexts, including the framework of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, probably with the focus particularly on the Black Sea, to assert its rights, including navigational freedom, rights to the territorial shelf, and so on. But these various efforts in various legal contexts, various legal fora, have not directly engaged Russia as a country that arguably and ostensibly has been committing aggression. Now, maybe that's not altogether a bad thing. The word ambiguity has been used. Is it a constructive ambiguity? I mean, is it really a good thing to have Russia part of the Normandy format and to have former President Kravchuk, representing Ukraine and dealing with Russia, given his own past, having, I think, given or allowed Crimea to have a certain autonomy within the framework of Ukraine? It does permit diplomacy, but it could result in, as has been suggested in our discussion already, a kind of special status for the Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbass region, which would not be consistent with the sovereignty, the territorial integrity, or the security of Ukraine. Now, what can the United States do? Clearly, to maintain a policy of non-recognition. And there are the analogy with the Cold War and the Baltic states is not a bad one. But in the end, the Baltic states did emerge and did not need to be recognized as independent countries. Under the Yalta Agreement, Belarus, White Russia, and Ukraine were sovereign countries, formally speaking, from the very beginning, of the creation of the United Nations organization. So I think to maintain that formal position is quite important. And then providing practical support, interoperability of weapons, that kind of thing. Connections such as the one we're making right now with an institution, the Diplomatic Academy in Ukraine is very important. Professor Arvanitopoulos has emphasized the importance of trade relations. The EU is doing quite a lot and probably can do more. It's having internal problems. Ukraine itself, I think, and this is the idea that has most emerged in my mind as I've been listening to this discussion. It wasn't that long ago, at the end of the Cold War, the late 1980s, early 1990s, when the idea of middle powers was reemerging. As some countries like Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa, Pakistan, South Korea, and Ukraine could emerge as new middle powers in the world. Elizabeth Prodromou mentioned the relationship between Ukraine and Turkey as a kind of link between the two, you know, across the Black Sea, from the Baltic, you know, all the way down to the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean. The foreign minister of Ukraine, the new foreign minister, has proposed the idea of Ukraine being a nexus between the European Union and Asia. You know, where my understanding is that Ukraine's diplomatic presence has not been all that prominent, particularly in Central Asia. So it is important, I think, that Ukraine itself assert its personality on the world stage, on the global stage. I mean, not merely in the Euro-Atlantic contest, you know, with a somewhat broader focus. And I know that because of what Ukraine has to export, I mean, in its flag, you know, the yellow stands for wheat. India is a major market for Ukrainian wheat. And the more those trade relationships can be used to sensitize the trading partners of Ukraine to Ukraine's perspectives on things more generally, there can be built up diplomatically within the world an understanding of the Ukrainian position, which could be helpful in the context of the United Nations and in other international fora. So this notion of Ukraine asserting itself as a middle power, which is of course not a formal category, but it really is a power, but given its current handicap, given its imperfect sovereignty, given that some of its territory is not effectively under its control, it's difficult. But I think it should assert itself anyway. And I think that would command a certain attention in the United States so that people are not just getting tired of hearing about the Ukraine problem. Ukraine can really arise as a country with a very distinct identity and assert itself not only because it's being challenged, but because it has a lot to offer.
Great, thank you, Alan, and for those comments. And I think we can all agree that it is important for Ukraine to assert itself and play a bigger role in the region for all the different topic areas that we've discussed thus far. Ambassador Korsunsky, perhaps I could turn back to you for your thoughts after this wide-ranging discussion.
Yes, Chris, thank you. I have now 3 things to respond. First, let me start with to clarify what just was mentioned by Professor Henrikson. When I said guarantor, I meant the perception of the Ukrainians about the United States, not about the treaty relations. Of course, I know we don't have a defense agreement with the United States, although we would love to have one. We do have a statement, a kind of official strategic relations put on the paper, but of course there is no guarantee in legal terms. But perception is that there is only one power which can really be helpful in defending us. And when we see right now, today, we saw another US ship entering Bosphorus, heading to the Black Sea during the active phase of Caucasus 2020 military exercise. Russia, Belarus, China, and other countries will conduct right close to our borders. And when we see 3 times already in a week, we have B-52 flying over Ukrainian territory and very close to Crimea. So that's a kind of an assistance, a very important sign of US eye over the region, over the Ukraine, and what is happening around the Crimea. So that's what I meant. Then I would like to comment on what Constantine said about some figures. Constantine, you're absolutely right. European Union removed all the tariffs, but excuse me, they introduced quotas, and those quotas so small that we completely exhaust them in a month, 1 month of the year, and all quotas or what we can sell to the EU without tariffs is already exhausted. 1 month, 2 months is very small amount of goods and services we can sell to the EU, and that is exactly why we want to not to renegotiate, but we have now a right after 3 years to ask for another discussions about the free trade regime, and we try to remove those quotas because this is a kind of something which put quite restrictions on our trade. You are again, we are very grateful. You're absolutely right. In addition to this trade and the visa liberalization, we do have a huge package of assistance in billions, and this is very important, and we are very grateful for that. But let me as well mention to you that 2016, 17, and 18, the single country which was a major trade partner for Ukraine, that was Russia. So during the war, in spite of the fact that we do have a free trade agreement with the EU, in spite of the fact that Ukrainian export to EU was growing like in numbers. So it was drastical growth of our export, but much quicker export from EU was growing to Ukraine. And still it was Russia until the 2019. 2019, for the first time, another beautiful country became a major trade partner for Ukraine, that is China. And this year, China will be again. So the question again, look, for us, for professionals, we understand what's going on, but we have a 40 million population, and this population looks at figures in the media, what they see. They see complaints from Ukrainian producers that we cannot, the 1 month of the year, January ended, quota is already exhausted. So what we're talking about, at the same time, we have China, and China is buying everything. Literally whatever we grow on our fields as agricultural superpower, they buy. Doesn't matter what we're talking about. So, and that is $12 billion of trade with China. This is huge, and this is very important. Again, when we talk in our world, when we talk about this two superpower now struggle, you know that better than anybody else, US and China. The question is, with whom we, if China is a major trade partner? So this is quite another challenge. So what I mean that I agree with you, the glass is half full. I'm not saying, I'm not questioning relations with the EU. This is paramount priority. We have no choice but to be very close to EU. But the question is that we want much more fair relations. We want EU to be much more sober about our ability to diversify our trade. When we can't sell, we can't have trade relations with Russia right now. We have to diminish them. It's very difficult for us to find another markets. So and so on and so on. So, but I just want to clarify. Of course, it's half full. Of course, EU #1. Of course, we will continue. But the point is that we want a much more better trade regime. And as far as I know, we put forward this proposal vis-a-vis EU and only COVID. And the EU is very, busy with COVID. So we will see what happens. But what will happen? But definitely, EU, this is a kind of issue we are not even questioning. And then finally, I would like to comment on what Oksana mentioned about Crimea and Donbass. I would like to say, Oksana, that your students are pretty good. It is not possible to implement Minsk agreements. We know that, and Russia knows that. And Germany knows that. So, if you read those documents and the legal document, you see they already have to be implemented in 2015. So what we're talking about 5 years later, that is why Kravchuk is saying one thing today, he will say another thing tomorrow. But actually, let's put it simply, we are buying time. We try to go step by step, very small step after another very small step. Exchange of prisoners, ceasefire, disengagement of troops, to try to keep as low casualties as possible, try to keep Russians from entering into active military actions in occupied territories against our military. But we understand Russia, I mean, natural course of things will take care of their Putin and over Russia too. We do see some signs of, in Russia, of some signs of vulnerabilities in their economy. Maybe for 2-3 years they will survive without Western technologies and Western assistance. But what will happen next? Because the world is going forward. And even, let me put it, it's clear for us. It's not about United States anymore. It's about China too, for Russians. So they're very much worried about China. Which China is going forward. I mean, they don't care about Russia. They're not afraid about Russia. So they don't know what to do with China. That's why they have eternal friendship. So that's the point about what we see about Minsk, about Crimea. We see now very much more active. It looks like that new first deputy minister of foreign affairs, Aminet Japarova, she is Crimean Tatar, and she is now trying to put forward a very active platform, a long list of actions on every possible organization or framework or whatever to push Russians to make them be visible what they are doing in Crimea. We put them in the court. We will put them in the court. Many cases have been prepared. We will put them in Geneva and Hague in different courts, trying to push them about the Crimea. Of course, we understand it's not going to happen tomorrow, but we will wait. It's not possible to recognize. Professor Henrikson was absolutely right. Number one, the policy of unrecognition. Never ever, like with Georgia, like with Moldova, like with other Russian, those conflicts Russia embedded in the former Soviet Union territory, we have to continue non-recognition and sanctions and wait. And definitely you will see in this year already, next year, much more active position from Ukraine. That's we know for sure, because I mean, I'm kind of part of internal discussions of that, and I'm very happy to see much more clear plans what to do, how to move forward to push Russians. So sorry, took too long, but I had to respond to those 3 issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are very helpful comments. I see a couple other hands up. Let me turn first to Dr. Dubovik.
Well, thank you, Chris. Indeed, it's a very good, stimulating discussion. The food for thought is here and there, so there is an urge to react. And first on what was generated by what Oxana said in her little short but very full of different issues contribution. Are we aware that Russians might be going to the water access for Crimea? We are. At this point, 6+ years into the conflict, we know that Russia can expand anytime they like, and that's not limited to the Donbass only. There presumably has been some preparations for that, and there was some training for Ukrainian military in the Kherson region next to Crimea. So, I mean, we are probably ready for that, but we'll see. I mean, it depends, of course, on how large scale and if they even do try to pull out something like that. We are also aware that there is an Azov situation by now, of course, obviously all of us. As Alexander Khara has mentioned, there is also Odessa, and there is this opportunity for Russia, if they want to introduce blockade of the entire coast, along Odessa and not just Odessa. They've trained for that. I mean, we've seen them doing this, and they messed with our NATO exercises in respect of, interfering with exercises there. So we'll see. I mean, there are all opportunities there. I mean, we got to be ready that this is not going to be limited to Donbass only. But on Crimea, it's very helpful that Ukrainians themselves are getting their acts together in terms of thinking what our strategy on Crimea is. And as Ambassador Korsunsky mentioned, and Nejapar and others are thinking about what we should do about Crimea first, because we need to say A, and then our Western friends might join us in terms of how they are reacting to the whole Crimea situation. That's important, because if Ukraine is not, speaking in one voice or not having a position, then what our friends in the West can say. Kyiv should say the first word here. The Western position is unfortunately seems to be that too many players in the West are very much eager and ready to take Crimea out of the brackets. And that's a problem. And as was already seen, already said, with the Crimea Declaration by State Department 2 summers ago, was that, the Stimson Declaration #2. And it took half a century for Stimson Declaration to lead to the creation of 3 Baltic republics and the crush of the Soviet system. So what would it take, I don't know, for Ukraine to get Crimea back? That's another huge conversation we can have. But currently, of course, it's very important to see our support coming for us on Crimea as well, not just on Donbass from our Western friends. There is criticism of Minsk that's been addressed by Ambassador Korsunsky fully. Is there a plan B? I'm not sure about that. I mean, our government, our leadership, current political leadership is saying that they have some kind of plan B. They fail in their negotiation process with Russians, on Donbass. I'm not sure they do, and I'm not sure if there is one. So we got to stick to the game we're playing. We don't like it. Minsk obviously was forced on us. We've been imposed on us. They forced down our throats when we're weak and down and our hands went tied. And that's how it is. But can we rethink Minsk? Can we modify Minsk? We would love to. But for that, also, actually, we would need some support from our Western partners. And neither Berlin or Paris is especially enthusiastic about it. And US is absent. That's another thing. I mean, as Oksana has said, I think that US should be part of it too. I thought from the get-go that US should be part of this multilateral negotiation framework on Donbass to help Ukraine, but the US wasn't. Early on in Geneva, Secretary Kerry was there, but that's it. It's not part of Normandy. So there is talk of Normandy Plus or something like that. Would Washington like to explore that or not? Would Moscow allow that or not? That's a whole bunch of questions out there. But personally, as someone who is dealing with US-Ukraine relations, I very much regret that the United States has not been part of this larger format. And most finally here, I think on what Elizabeth Prodromou said, that interesting, I just didn't think about it until you said it, Elizabeth, that there is very little that we hear on the effects of Tomos, of the creation of the new Ukrainian, of the Kephalos Church here, because some people have these expectations there's going to be like a huge event, a cataclysmic event. It's going to upend the political landscape in Ukraine and so on in the region, and actually didn't. So that's interesting. I don't know, is it a positive thing or a negative thing? But fortunately, at least we didn't have, people belonging to different confessional groups and organizational church groups fighting each other in the streets of Ukraine, as some people did expect at some point. So we'll see. I mean, I guess it's an issue that requires a special look at why is that happening? Why we're not saying some kind of avalanche of events related to the creation of that new Ukrainian church. So that's interesting. But ideologically, that's also interesting that you brought it up, Elizabeth. The Russian world strategy, the concept is still very much alive and kicking. Actually, I think it's coming back for another round because when Russia attacked us in 2014, they did so at the expense of their soft power with military force, and they lost some of their leverage in terms of soft power. But now, after 6+ years of conflict, they're trying to do both. That's why we call it hybrid sometimes. Some people don't like it. But they're using, again, this Russian world thing. There is one nation thing. There is 3 East Slavic brotherly nations, which was mentioned just, I think, today or yesterday by Lukashenko and Putin also in Sochi. So, and there is a growing, unfortunately, there's a growing prowess for pro-Russian parties in Ukraine as well, which is kind of paradoxical. We still have a war with them on our hands, but at the same time, part of the Ukrainian electorate and part of the Ukrainian political elite is very much willing to explore all those ideas dealing with Russian world and stuff like that. So that's another trend that we need to follow. Thank you.
Great. Well, we're getting close to the end of our allotted time. Maybe I'll turn to Dr. Gaber for any final comments from her side, and then I'll try to wrap up our discussion.
Thank you, Chris. Actually, I'd like to react to many different comments, but I'll try to keep it short. Just referring to what Professor Henrikson said, and I like this point very much, and I want to stress it once again. The problem with Russia is actually that its policy of denying what it's doing. And the very last example, which we witnessed, was that of Alexei Navalny and Novichok. It's kind of not post-truth era even, it's a theater of absurd, when Kremlin said that basically it's in Germany that he got poisoned and absolutely denying everything. But that's the problem with Russia. When we talk about Ukraine, when we talk about the Black Sea region, when we talk about any other country, that's not the point for Russia to actually get some territories or get some people involved in destabilizing situation in that particular country, like in Montenegro or in Ukraine or whatever. That's the point of sitting together with the Western powers, with the other global actors, and these so-called middle powers like Ukraine, Turkey, whatever, would only act as a reason to come together to the same table with the US or China and say, okay, so now we're not a troublemaker, but rather a problem solver. So let's discuss how to react to those problems. And it's important for us as Ukraine specifically to stress on each and every platform and on every occasion that the state who is the source of the problem cannot be an honest broker, cannot be a moderator for some processes, and cannot be a problem solver, because those problems were actually created by that very state in order to come together, to bargain, and to see what it can get in some issue in some country in order to deliver on some other dimension. So that's very important. And here I agree absolutely with Professor Henrikson. And also what Dr. Prodromou said, one of the very important dimensions of what Russia has been doing is cultural diplomacy and religious diplomacy, but I would not only bring it to those dimensions, because you can also mention science diplomacy, which is very popular now. And that science diplomacy is starting from sending some kind of scientific expeditions to humanitarian assistance to the very heart of EU for kind of fighting pandemic COVID-19. And then you can see all these cyber attacks, hacking different sites, trying to get to the information about the vaccines, and then again coming up as a problem solver. So see, we in Russia have some kind of very specific magical vaccine that will save the world. What is important here for Ukraine, I would say, is to react, of course, but not to act within this Russian narrative. So to react some kind of with the asymmetric responses. So if we take cultural diplomacy, for example, that would not be promoting Ukrainian language. And here I may not agree with Professor Dubovik, who said that we have kind of this Russian Mir again in Ukraine and the rise of opposition parties like OPA Bloc. Yes, we do have rise in the popularity of those parties, but I would say that the reasons are very much social and economic. And the reason is the dissatisfaction with the current government rather than this argument of Russian culture, Russian language, and so on. I don't think people buy it so easily now as they used to do it in 2014 or before 2014, because if it didn't happen in so-called Novorossiya, in Odessa, in Crimea, in Donetsk, Luhansk, or even in Belarus, creating this one state, then it will most probably fail again in other regions of Ukraine. But on our side, on Ukrainian side, what might be a cultural diplomacy and what this first Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, Emina Japarova, is doing now is trying to consolidate all different issues of destroying cultural heritage in Crimea, for example, by Russians, like the Bakhchisarai Palace, for example, like destroying mosques. And that might be another argument of coming to the international courts, of bringing the issue to UNESCO, to United Nations, and showing that actually Russia is not only aggressor, but also someone who has no respect towards the world's cultural heritage. And the same is for the religious diplomacy. I would not like to stick to Thomas' issue, the only issue of religious diplomacy in Ukraine, not to limit our influence, say, only for the Orthodox population, or to show that we prioritize one religious group over the other. I would say that the most advantageous position for us would be now to show that Ukraine is a liberal state where religious freedoms are respected, first because it will not trigger Russia again to come and say, look, some others from the Russian Moscow Patriarchate people who go to those churches again get their human rights violated. then to show that we are a really multicultural, multi-religious state with democratic rules for Jews, for Catholics, for Orthodox, whatsoever, but also to play this Muslim card in a good sense of the word, because in Crimea we have several millions of Crimean Tatars who are Muslims, and that would be also a part of religious diplomacy of Ukraine, as we're doing now, for example, to talk to those states who are members of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, and to bring it to their attention as well, that basically the human rights and the religious freedom of Crimean Tatars who are now in Crimea are also being violated by Russia. So here it's a huge and vast area of different ways how to cooperate with Turkey, including, and to use it in pragmatic terms, because, and that's the last point I would like to make, as an expert on Turkey, I cannot skip the Turkish issue. Yes, Turkey has always been very pragmatic in its foreign policy, and what I can say is I can see as a positive development is that Ukraine is getting more and more pragmatic in its politics towards Turkey as well. So in some respect, I would say that this kind of new emerging defense industrial cooperation with Turkey benefits both sides, Ukraine and Turkey. And for NATO, I would say Ukraine might also be another anchor of transatlantic dimension in Turkey, because Ukraine is mostly viewed as a, of course, European country with the aspirations for EU and NATO membership, but it does not trigger that negative reaction in Ankara as sometimes Brussels or Washington do. So I think that here it's important really to maintain this balance, but also to keep developing this cooperation, both to hold Turkey in this European, Euro-Atlantic sphere and not to push it closer to Russia, but also for Ukraine to use cooperation with the Turkey as a counterbalance to growing Russian military and diplomatic and political presence in the region. And I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much for those comments. It's been, I think, a fascinating set of topics brought up over the course of the last hour and a half. I think if we'd held this conversation a couple of years ago, it would have been solely about relations with Russia and the war. And although obviously that's far from resolved, it's in some ways, I think, an optimistic picture to show that the U.S., Ukraine, and the relationship between Ukraine and the West more generally, that those relations have broadened beyond that single issue to take into account Black Sea security more generally, the Eastern Mediterranean, which we touched on and which I wasn't expecting, very pleased to hear about. So I'm certainly very appreciative of all of our colleagues, both from Fletcher and also those in Kiev and Odessa who joined. Very delighted to begin this conversation, and hopefully we can continue cooperation between our institutions as we go forward. So thank you again, everyone, and look forward to continuing our discussions.